A little skip on the software, but we're here. Talks News, Wednesday, January 13th, 2021. Thank you for joining me. It's the Wacko Weirdo Rebel Scum Jedi Hero. Depending on what side of the aisle you're sitting on. So, today we have a Militia Watch Wednesday update. Their update came out Tuesday, usually comes out Mondays, but we're going to get onto it today. Of course, it's going to be pretty busy this week since there was a bit of an insurrection last week, and I'm sure that's going to get a little bit into it. I haven't read it yet. I like to read them cold. And then we're going to be making the rounds through the right-wing echo chamber just to see how things are really going. And that is the plan for today's episode. So, yet again, ooh, I did it wrong. I want to thank you for joining me. And I hope you enjoy this alternative intro music. My computer's acting a little cray-cray. But now that I have things all in order, switch it over here. Oh, yeah. And I didn't seem to line up my camera for this, so that was bad. If you want to see me update the camera, check out the YouTube channel. Talks News, YouTube. Fix that up right here, huh? Oh, there I am. Hey, hi, hello. There I am. Yeah. Let's just move it over there. Got me taking up the logo, huh? All right, that's gonna do it. So, I did have one thing to say before we really... No, I'll save that just before we get into the video segments. But we'll dive right into the Militia Watch update. If you want to follow these yourself or get more in-depth articles, go to militia.watch. I have it saved on my browser, bookmarked, kept, because it's very important. Honestly, it's got units, movements, and ideology. And all of these things happen in the shadows, mainly because mainstream media doesn't really cover a lot of it. But Militia Watch is there just for this. So, it begins. The last week has been a big one, to say the least. Here's a weekly update covering some of the following in very broad strokes. So, of course, if you want to find out more information, do the research. But we're going to get into some of that here now, just the light brush strokes. The storming of the U.S. Capitol building is one point. Militias and other militant far-right groups show at multiple state capitol buildings. And social media platform revolt. You've likely already read a lot of this, given how high up in the news it's been this past week, so this is going to be mainly for record keeping. Alright, so the first one being the storming of the Capitol. No real summary of this is needed as far as Militia Watch is concerned. However, from a Militia Watch perspective, the extent of militia involvement is worthwhile to document here. For a full overview with documentation from on-the-ground reporters and scene captures, please reference the following Twitter thread. Which in this Twitter thread, they do highlight some of the iconography and groups that were at the Capitol, such as Oath Keepers, Sons of Liberty, Proud Boys, QAnon supporters. So if you go to Militia Watch's Twitter, at Militia Watch, they have this thread that I too also think is pretty important to get brushed up if you want to be familiar with the militia groups. So, groups present at the Capitol ahead of and through the storming, both militia and far-right, represented here. You had the Sons of Liberty, New Jersey, relatively new militia group, distinct from the Illinois Sons of Liberty that many people likely have heard about in some regard. Note their matching uniforms and their evocation of the Tree of Liberty on their flag. The tree is a reference to a Thomas Jefferson quote popular with the armed right, quote, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is natural manure," unquote. The quote was written by Jefferson to a diplomatic official in London in late 1787, 4 years after the end of the American Revolutionary War. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, but notably was not involved militarily in the U.S. Revolution. It's funny that he would write about the necessity of the blood of patriots and tyrants, and yet did not go through the military. So, the academic type stepping away from the battlefield in order to, keep those ideas safe. America First and the Groiper Army. Groiper? All right. Led by Unite the Right attendee Nick Fuentes, America First represents a burgeoning Christian neo-fascist movement skimming momentum off of the MAGA and Stop the Steal movements. And I think Nick Fuentes was active on YouTube. I'm not 100% sure if his videos are still kept up. We had Oath Keepers. Oath Keepers were founded in 2009 after Barack Obama's winning electoral bid and draw from veterans and law enforcement agencies for their membership. They swear to uphold their oath to defend the U.S. from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Then we had the Proud Boys. The Proud Boys are a far-right street fighting organization that claims to be a Western chauvinist or men's drinking club organization. It was founded by Vice founder Gavin McInnes, who now claims to have left the group after he was put on the FBI terrorist watch list. Three Percenters, also there. The Three Percenter movement, like the Oath Keepers, were founded in reaction to Barack Obama taking the White House. The Three Percenters movement is full of fractures, splinters, and independent groups, making it often difficult to discern networks and coalitions of demonstrators who claim to be Three Percenters. We have NSC 131. The NSC 131 is a New England-based neo-Nazi group. NSC stands for National Social Club, National Socialism being Nazism, and 131 refers to ACA, or Anti-Communist Action. NSC 131 were not publicly identified at the rally, but a member posted to a closed Telegram channel that they were in attendance. Since this is a good bit outside the purview of usual Militia Watch writing, here's an ADL profile on the group. So they have an American Defamation League profile on NSC 131 if anyone is interested in finding out more. More groups were likely present and not identified by their brand of icons and symbols. It's likely that this will remain a developing story, particularly as boasts and or arrests come out in the coming weeks. And there have been several arrests of people that had stormed the Capitol. Other state capitals also protested on the 6th of January. Many other capitals had organized protests set for the 6th of January, and several of these had armed and militia contingents showed up. This is not an exhaustive list, but a few to highlight. In Lansing, Michigan, a member of the Michigan Liberty Militia attending the Lansing, Michigan rally on the 6th of January had the following to say to a Patch reporter about the Michigan Wolverine Watchmen arrested last year. The Michigan Wolverine Watchmen being the ones who wanted to kidnap Governor Whitmer and hold her to a trial. The quote says, "All I can say about that is that they are not guilty. I know them guys personally, and that's not the case. It will all get played out in court, and we'll find out the truth." Cool, unquote. This admission is not particularly surprising that a Michigan Liberty Militia member is personally connected to the Wolverine Watchmen, given the substantial evidence that the two are intricately connected. Recall that over a dozen alleged Wolverine Watchmen members were arrested and charged in October 2020 for their plans to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, after which they planned to put her on trial at a secure location. Brian Higgins, one of those charged, appealed his extradition request this past week and was denied. In Olympia, Washington, armed protesters marched from the state capitol to the governor's mansion. Armed protesters among them shouted up at the mansion. Among these armed individuals, a man with a Hitler Youth dagger hitched to his shoulder webbing screamed, "Kill all boomers." Cool. Salt Lake City, Utah, Columbia, South Carolina, and Salem, Oregon, Tallahassee, Florida, and more host Proud Boys. Proud Boys featured quite strongly on January 6th state capitol showings, from Utah to South Carolina to Oregon to Florida to Ohio. In many cases, they got involved in street fights or intimidated by force journalists and their political opponents. In Atlanta, Georgia, organized by local far-right political platform American Patriots USA, APUSA, a few armed protesters gathered at the Georgia Capitol. Former KKK leader and Unite the Right attendee Chester Doles read from a script announcing the election result. Three Percenters Security Force led by Chris Hill, was also in attendance. All four of these individuals and organizations mentioned in this paragraph were part of an Militia Watch published network map around Kelly Loeffler, who lost her election this past week, and they have an article on that if you want to see. And as a general follow-up from Militia Watch, the follow-up to the J6 action in D.C. and state capitals across the country has led to a bit of a reckoning from a few different fronts. Far-right internet forums exploding with violent threats ahead of and throughout the day's events have faced swift and decisive response from service providers, such as Parler's removal from Amazon Web Services and the App Store. The dust hasn't quite settled on this story yet, but these and other actions, such as Twitter's ban of Donald Trump's personal account, are likely to have massive impacts on this moment as we look towards 2021. And that's mainly what we're going to get into here. We're going to talk a little bit on civil liberties, freedom of speech, and the crackdown on the web. And I just want to highlight here this one story that came out of Media Matters. Media Matters is the same. It gives me the same vibes as Militia Watch, where they focus in on watching a particular section of the right wing, and they focused in on Newsmax here. And it says, Newsmax contributor says Trump is being impeached in order to provoke riots on Inauguration Day. And that's the thing, though, is that when you say those things, you steer the narrative. So there's not necessarily a lot of truth in there, because why would Democrats or the opposition to Donald Trump want more riots, more violence? That just suggests that the government is out to destabilize its own nation for whatever reason. I haven't clicked the article or listened to his reasoning here. But just saying in order to provoke riots on Inauguration Day gives it that kind of plausible deniability of also planting the seed in the people that we just talked about them actually taking action on Inauguration Day. And as far as I've heard so far, that there are actually protests planned throughout all 50 states on Inauguration Day. And a lot of them have to deal with the MAGAs, the Stop the Steals, and far-right militia groups. So you can already see here from this Media Matters article that they are trying to steer the narrative in keeping everyone who supports Donald Trump furious. So, making our rounds through the right-wing echo chamber, we begin with Fox News. It has Joe Concha doubting that the Biden admin will improve big tech censorship. Now, the thing about, I don't like this censorship of free speech. It's in the First Amendment. It's protected. The terrible thing here is that when you incite violence on a platform that is owned by a private company, which had you agree to terms of service, terms and conditions before you use the website, and then you violate those terms and conditions, the company has their legal right to do what they did to Donald Trump's account. They have the legal, it's on their side. Legality is on their side. Now, I wonder if they would be able to take this to the Supreme Court and try to break that in with the First Amendment. But then, that would kind of open the floodgates for a lot of other businesses in, what they're allowed to do to their workers and other stuff like that. I just find like what's really interesting about the argument is that somebody like, if Twitter is a private company and can do whatever they want, then all these small businesses should be able to open. And it's I don't know, it's just kind of like backwards thinking a little bit, to think that like since a company can hold people to the terms and conditions of their service, then other businesses should be allowed to ignore either state or federal law in order to open their business and spread COVID. I think my brain just farted super hard. Oh man. Yeah, that was a hard fart. But what also is pretty interesting about the same people who make the argument against Twitter having that lockdown argument in their back pocket, but also refuse to wear masks when they're mandated at certain businesses, that just adds like another level of hypocrisy. So like if a business says that we require masks for you to come in, which happens in a lot of states that don't have a mandatory mask ordinance or anything like that, businesses will put it into their policy. And then the people making the argument that Twitter shutting down Trump means that other businesses can open would not want to wear masks in those businesses. So it's, we're basically just doing mental gymnastics to try and justify the actions of Donald Trump so that he can remain on Twitter and continue tweeting out to his millions of supporters so that they stay furious and angry, even though he has his press conferences that he can do at any moment, and he has a like well of right-wing media to do it for him. But this whole crackdown thing has been happening a while. I brought it up earlier, back when like Steven Crowder got reprimanded by YouTube for calling Carlos Maza of Vox a wispy queer. Bigoted speech. That's what that is. And his videos got demonetized in that, and it probably began before then, but that's really when it started ramping up in my eyes, that they started feeling like, oh, the conservatives are being repressed for the things that we say, and my free speech is being infringed upon. But he broke the terms and services of YouTube, and a lot of people aren't really going to, unless they're right wing and also agree with his bigoted views, aren't going to agree with the position that he takes, simply because he was spreading hate speech. So, when they demonetized his videos for that, saying, hey, take down that video or bleep it out or do something about it and we can remonetize your videos, I thought that was completely justified, just because Crowder spent a lot of his time, and it wasn't just that video, it was several videos where he was making fun of Carlos Maza just for being gay. So, yeah, we're having a massive conversation in this nation about free speech on the internet. And it even extends to when protesters try to block like a certain speaker from speaking at their college. And it broadens, like, do we let bigoted hate speech go on for the sake of the First Amendment, or do those ideas spread and further repress other people, such as gay people, minorities, transgendered people? Like, the list goes on of the discrimination list that comes from the conservative right wing. So, yeah, there's a broader conversation to have, but we're going to get into these topics now.
Back with a Fox News alert. YouTube joining Twitter and Facebook and suspending President Trump from his account.
Fox News contributor Joe Concha joins us now. Joe, I mean, come on, man. YouTube will reportedly not even identify the offending video. What does that tell you?
Pyro, was that Randy Moss? Come on, man.
So this video came out yesterday, and I'm pretty sure I had heard yesterday what video it was, and it was the video where Trump, it was after January, after the riot and insurrection itself. Donald Trump had come out and said that this isn't the end, it's only the beginning. That was the video. So them claiming that there is no video or that Twitter hasn't cited it, I'm not 100% sure on that, whether or not Twitter has cited it specifically, but I am aware of what the video was.
Man, or was that Joe Biden? Come on, man.
That
I want
was
to make sure
everybody's come on,
I got
man.
the context. Yeah, right. Hey, look, this doesn't make a lot of sense, guys, because this is YouTube's actual statement. Given the ongoing concerns about violence, we will also be indefinitely disabling comments on President Trump's channel, as we've done with other channels when it comes to safety concerns. The comment section in YouTube, just like almost every political publication you read out there, is an absolute cesspool. And there isn't a lot of moderation going on in general. And this whole notion that somehow Twitter is sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows, no, that's a very ugly place as well. So this is...
Yeah, I don't know what specifically he's talking about, but most of the time they only crack down on specific violators of their terms and service that usually deal with like hate speech or even the incitement of violence or even the threatening of violence. But yeah, if you go into the Twitter mentions and comments section, it's mostly just people grandstanding each other. There's no actual healthy discourse or exchange of ideas. It's mostly people canceling each other and grandstanding and holier than thou bullshit, which, you know, you just become aware. That's what Twitter is. Like, when did we decide that Twitter was the new grand town hall for the entire world? That's so foolish.
This is just another excuse to take President Trump away from a way to communicate with the outside world. He's already lost Facebook.
And see, and that's what's like really ridiculous. But like, yeah, social media is super important to communicating in this world. But he's the president of the United States. He can literally have a press conference whenever he wants. On top of it, he can have his press secretary go out and have press conferences whenever. So like him not having an ability to communicate with the American people, that's not it. That's not it. It's blocking him from constantly spamming the idea of a fraudulent election that has no evidence.
Facebook, he's already lost Twitter, he's already lost Snapchat. You could go down the line. It's something like a dozen now in terms of the way he communicates. And YouTube, obviously, is owned by Google. So this is, again, tech giants putting their weight on the scales as far as taking President Trump off any way to actually communicate with the American people.
Joe, can you describe what it might take for, you know, this to come back and bite those people who at this point are now celebrating this? Because right now, you know, I mean, it is obviously a lot of conservatives who are saying that this is happening to them, that they're being censored. But it's not that difficult to imagine a world in which everybody might be affected by this at some point.
Yeah, we're all living in silos.
And I've already seen the meme going around. Like, first they came for the president and I said nothing because I wasn't the president. It's just like just don't step out of the lines of the terms and service. It's pretty easy. But of course they're also going to talk about like it's whatever the left doesn't want to hear. It's whatever Twitter doesn't want to hear. But like when they're not focusing in on what exactly the message and like what the consequence came from. When they're not, what they're looking at is the effect and ignoring the causation. And yeah, that just helps Trump and further radicalizes people in this idea that the oppression is coming for them. You're a Republican. You are going to be oppressed because of your Christian values.
That's right. We're just talking to each other in echo chambers. Look,
I like how he said that we're just talking to each other in echo chambers when like this episode is literally about going through the right-wing echo chamber. I dig it. I love it. I'm here for it.
I think always money solves the problem, Mealy. In other words, you have Google stock is down 60 points over the last couple of days. You have.
I think what honestly, like the right wing where they fucked up is that they don't have their own web services. If they had like Dennis Prager, or I don't know, Rockefeller, if there's still a Rockefeller alive, one of them to go out and just, you know, open a web service and have servers to host nothing but conservative websites, then they wouldn't have anything to worry about. But Amazon did it to save its own ass because Amazon's there to please everybody. But, you know, of course, they're not going to look at it like that because Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, and the Washington Post is fake news liberal bullshit. So, you know, the easiest solution for them is to find servers that agree with their ideology, and that way they can avoid getting banned when they say bigoted shit.
have Twitter stock that's taken a big fall as well. When you alienate half the country, that tends to do that. But the problem here is that you have a Democratic-controlled Washington coming in a week, Congress, Senate, and obviously the Oval Office. And it's hard to imagine, given all the donations that the Biden administration got and all the people from Silicon Valley that are going to work for the Biden administration, that very much is going to be done here. And even if you try to break up these companies, it's going to take years, given the legal resources that they have. So I hate to say there's not much that can be done right now, but there's really not much that can be done right now. They're privately owned companies.
With that, Joe, there's a Washington Post columnist who asked the question, and this is his question.
And he highlights it right there. They're privately owned companies. And what they want is for them to be regulated away from banning conservative thought, which most of the time, the only reason why they ban conservatives is because the disinformation campaigns, misinformation, and bigoted hate speech, or even incitement of violence or threats of violence.
How do we deprogram President Trump supporters? Take a listen.
There are millions of Americans, almost all white, almost all Republicans, who somehow need to be deprogrammed. It's as if they're members of a cult.
What alarm bells go off in the mind of Concha when he hears the word deprogram?
Eugene Robinson does sound like somebody who is in the movie 1984, doesn't he, with that voice? I mean, yeah, it sounds like he literally wants to deprogram you. Speaking of...
He just had to find a way to bring 1984 into it, of course. But 1984 is a book about fascism and how the government oppresses every civil liberty that we hold dear. So big tech companies doing it through their policies, that's not it. That's not what Orwell wrote about. Orwell wrote about all of our rights, such as the First Amendment, not being allowed to us. And the Ministry of Truth basically taking old pieces of newspaper and re-editing it only to fit the narrative of what the government wants. So we could say that the big tech is acting in accordance with the government or with Democrat leadership, but then you're actually putting on your conspiratorial hat, which does lead you to a realm of being closer to a cult. So
1984. So I went back and read it.
It's a good book. It's a really great book. What I really hate, though, is that right-wingers constantly keep quoting it without knowing that George Orwell was a fervent anti-fascist. He was Antifa. He was also a socialist, and he went to Catalonia specifically to shoot fascists. It's a great... Homage to Catalonia is another great book by him.
It's one of the best sellers out there right now. Quote, power is in tearing human minds to pieces and putting them back together in new shapes of your own choosing. That's actually in the book. And boy, that sounds a lot like what we heard on MSNBC. So this.
Yeah, but the book also says one of the first acts of the party was to tell people not to believe their eyes or their ears. And one of Trump's first, he made it known, he would not stop saying it constantly. That's fake news. That's fake news. That's fake news. That's fake news. That's him saying, don't believe your eyes, don't believe your ears, because what you're hearing is fake. That's 1984, and it was coming from an official in the government. That's much closer to 1984 than big tech companies doing that. Big tech companies doing that is much closer to cyberpunk, not even just the video game, but the whole science fiction genre of books where mega corporations actually have much more power than the governments or even the people. So we're more closer to cyberpunk than we are actually 1984. And also if we go into the cyberpunk, that's when we start talking about libertarian ideas and how they want a laissez-faire capitalist system where the mega corporations and multinationals are allowed to do whatever they want without government regulation.
This isn't about reprogramming the mind cleanly. This is about reprogramming the mind in a way that Eugene Robinson, who you just heard, wants it to be. And we saw this with PBS recently, and a lawyer there who said it's great that coronavirus cases were spiking in red states because they might infect Trump voters, and suggested Republican voters should have their children put in re-education camps. He was fired since then, but you see where this is going, right?
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with that sentiment either. Whoever said that, I don't really agree. But the thing is that we don't necessarily need re-education camps just as much as we need actually unfiltered truth and narratives without a spin. And we're just constantly getting that, whether it's left or right, we're constantly getting narrative spins rather than the straight truth and facts. And so if we achieve a level of honesty, we won't have to go through so-called re-education camps, but we have this right-wing media that is constantly battering people's minds with narratives that only fit their political agenda.
Right, guys?
Well, Joe Concha, thank you for joining us. Have a good day.
Oh, thank you. Off to get an MRI, Mealy. I tore a tendon in my arm while vacuuming when picking up a couch. I swear to God that happened.
Like Magda from There's Something About Mary picking up the couch. Yeah, don't do that.
That's exactly right, without actually lifting it. Long story.
All right, that was dumb. I don't know why I let that play on. All right, so then next we have the Benny Chaperone Shapiro at the Ben Shapiro Show, talking about Unreal. Antifa demands Andy No's book be removed from Portland bookstore. What I also thought was funny too is that Ben Shapiro has a video on his channel where he's reacting to the video that Daily Wire did that I covered last episode, where they walk around asking supposedly random people if there's any compromise on certain issues. Ben Shapiro reacts to that video. And just to tell you how idiotic that is that it's his company that made that video. So he probably had already seen it before reacting to it. And also, his company is the one who decided where to make the cuts and the edits. So, like, all of that was caricatured specifically for their viewers. And then on top of it, just to add a piece to the just to add a strawberry to the top of that cake, Ben Shapiro has to react to content that is his own. But I'm not going to get into that. We're not going to watch that. We're going to get into this Andy No bullshit.
So, by the way, if you thought that all of the censorship stuff was a little bit too on the nose, well, now we are in the realm of actual book burnings. So, over the last 24 hours, Antifa demanded that Powell's Books in Portland shut down the store if they carried Andy No's book on Antifa. So there are people in the mainstream media pushing for this. I mean, Sarah Zhang of the New York Times, she was pushing for Andy No to be banned from Twitter. Why? What was his grave crime? He would go to these Antifa rallies. He would film the Antifa rallies. He'd put up the tape of the Antifa rallies, and then he would identify with the photos the people who had been arrested at the Antifa rallies. And when I say rallies, I mean riots. Okay, but now Antifa showed up at this Portland store called Powell's Books, and they demanded that the store stop selling Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. That's the book by Andy. The protest forced the store to close early. Powell's then announced it would not carry the book in its physical store, though it would still be available for purchase online. The book will not be on our store shelves. We will not promote it, said Powell's. That said, it will remain in our online catalog. We carry books that we find anywhere from simply distasteful or badly written to execrable, as well as those we treasure. We believe it is the work of bookselling to do so. So here are some Antifa protesters outside Powell's Books explaining that if they stopped the release of the book, that would be like stopping the release of Mein Kampf. Here's some of that footage.
Stop selling Andy No's book.
You're on the
How can you have the
Stop
orange
selling
section?
Andy No's book.
How can you
Stop
have the
selling Andy No's book.
I don't care.
Stop selling Andy No's book. Stop selling Andy No's book. Stop selling Andy No's book.
Wait.
Stop selling Andy No's book.
Where's the part about Mein Kampf? Because I did not hear it. Hold on. I'm sorry.
Stop selling Andy No's book.
You're on the
How can you have the
Stop
orange
selling
section?
Andy No's book.
How can you
Stop
have the
selling Andy No's book.
I don't care.
Stop selling Andy No's book. Stop selling Andy No's book.
Yeah, I didn't hear anything about Mein Kampf. I feel like Ben Shapiro inserted that himself.
Orange section.
Stop selling Andy No's book. Stop selling Andy No's book. Stop selling Andy No's book.
Yeah, nothing quite says anti-fascism like in fascist fashion, closing a bookstore because someone was writing about how terrible you are. By the way, it's absolute cowardice for Powell's to...
It's not that that he's going to just talk shit. It's just mainly that Andy No deliberately spreads misinformation And he doxes people too, putting people's lives in danger. But Andy No willingly spreads misinformation for the sake of fascists. Like he walks around with patriot prayer and films to make them look good and to make anti-fascists look bad. So they're going to a bookstore and saying, "Hey, let's not publish or let's not sell this book by a known fascist apologist, please and thank you."
To remove the book from the actual shelves, right? That in and of itself is absolute cowardice on an extraordinary level. I mean, it is a bookstore. If the idea here is that bookstores can only carry books that the left agrees with, and just like it is the idea here that Facebook is only allowed to allow posts that Facebook agrees with, or Twitter is only allowed to allow posts that Twitter agrees with. And not only that, if you are an outlet that does not implement the same standards as Facebook or Twitter does with regard to its policing of content, that you can have your web service removed, the culture of free speech is dead. And then once the culture of free speech is dead, then it's just a question as to when the law changes, right? Because the law always follows the culture. The minute that the culture of free speech dies in America, it's really just the Supreme Court standing.
This is radicalization. Only because, like, you know, trying to hinder the work of fascists, this is what I'm saying when it gets into a broader discussion of free speech, is that it's not really up to the government to ensure that fascist speech isn't spread, because then that is I would say like a superpower or an authority cracking down on free speech. But if it's the people themselves, the proletariat, if you will, if they are the ones who are shutting it down, that is them using their First Amendment free speech to use consequentially against someone else who is using their free speech in the name of let's just say hate at this point. So you know, I'm all for the freedom of speech, but the thing that conservatives have to be comfortable with is that there are consequences to freedom of speech, and that might mean popular movements by the people to shut it down.
Between the left and the destruction of actual legal free speech in the country. And we've had articles from people who are now going to be in the Biden administration talking openly about why we need to adopt European standards with regard to free speech, i.e. banning quote-unquote hate speech, meaning stuff that the left doesn't like very often. Hate speech encompasses everything from actual horrible speech to things like saying that a transgender man is actually still a biological woman. Right?
But the thing is that, like, even though that may still be true, Ben Shapiro only says that to remind the transgendered person that they cannot escape who he thinks that they are. It's a bigoted reason to say that. There's no other reason to, like, hey, my name's Jeffrey. I go by he, him. I transitioned about 10 years ago. And he's like, you're still biologically a woman, right? Like, why even say it? Why even say it? Everybody knows, but why even say it? Because you want to bring them down. That's the kind of speech that is being fought against by popular movements. So them not liking people using their democratic powers to shut down their democratic powers, it's just a further radicalization of the idea that Republicans are being oppressed, when really their ideas are being challenged because they're bigoted, they're hateful, and if to be perfectly honest, they're primeval. They're back in the day. Traditional viewpoints have no place in a world where the culture and society is constantly changing.
Right? If it were not for the barrier of the First Amendment, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, there's no question the left would be pushing for this stuff incredibly, incredibly hard right now, on the basis of all of this is a danger, all of this is incitement.
I really love the horseshoe theory that comes in here, that like left-wing authoritarianism is probably the same thing as right-wing authoritarianism. Like, you go far enough down the left-wing spectrum and you get to the idea that we don't need hierarchies. So, like, it's literally the opposite of authoritarianism. Once you reach as far left as you can go, that's anarchy, and that demands horizontal hierarchical structures. Yeah, you might have leadership, but it is extremely hinged on democracy, those people in those leadership roles being held accountable by everybody and not just a few bodies who also might have vested interests in that person. So, yeah, the horseshoe theory nonsense, I'm just going to scoot past.
And everything is incitement. Remember, this argument is old. Okay, just because of what happened at the Capitol does not mean that this is a new argument. It's been an old argument. People were trying to shut down my speeches at places like Berkeley, requiring 600 police officers because they were suggesting that me standing in favor of free speech was actually fascism, right? Because words are violence.
No, it's the ideas that you speak about are pro-fascist, and that's what people are talking about. You're anti-immigrant, anti-communist. Those things are incredibly fascist in themselves. So yeah, that's what people are mainly fighting against. And they also don't want to hear you go onto college campuses to beat down transgendered people because you are you cling so hard to biology. So yeah.
Words are violence is literally what they were chanting. They were chanting, speech is violence. The Punch a Nazi movement that started a few years ago was also completely reliant on the idea that all of your fellow citizens are Nazis if they disagree with you.
No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. That's a hyperbole. No, it wasn't. And if anybody acts like that, then please do not call yourself an anti-fascist if you're going to consider every single person a fascist, because you're only going to hinder the movement itself. But yeah, he's exaggerating, just to make it a lot easier for those Republicans to go, oh, don't tread on me, no.
That is the direction the culture is moving. Facts don't care about your feelings.
And my feelings don't care about Ben Shapiro. All right, so that was the end of that. And now we have a great crossover episode from One American News Network, who has Dennis Prager of PragerU going on to talk about the left's lockstep pseudo-intellectualism. Oh boy.
So do you see people putting on intellectual airs for Zoom as just another symptom of some of the wider cultural problems we're experiencing right now?
Actually, I have a darker view than you do, and I actually welcome it. Anything that supports the purchase of books, even if it's a fake backdrop or wallpaper, I am for. I have told people actually over and over, you don't see this in my room. You just see my pipes in the background and the blinds. But I am facing about 1,000 books, and I have about 6,000 books.
We're just going to have to take his word for it. But I wonder if he has a copy of Origin of Species. One thing I know about Prager is that he is extremely Christian. And I think he also wants to reach the point where the United States goes off of the Bible as a rule of law rather than our Constitution or other legislation that we have.
I walk into homes and I am stunned at how many do not have one bookshelf. So I would actually advocate to people, buy books, even if you don't read them, just to say to the world, I take the world of the mind seriously.
How does that prove that you take the world of the mind seriously if you have books up there just to be antiques? That tells me, too, that he has 6,000 books just so that he can look intellectual. How is it the left's lockstep of pseudo-intellectualism and not Dennis Prager when he just told you to buy books so you can look smart?
That's actually a really great way of looking at things. And as we're talking about our society more broadly, I know you recently wrote a great piece called The Good German. And I was wondering if you could explain some of the premise of your article exactly and how it relates to some of the events that we've been seeing this past year.
This was one of the most difficult. I have 1,000 columns on the internet, and I've written 10 books, so I write a lot. This was probably the hardest piece I ever wrote, on so many levels. And I just simply opened up about a realization I have made in the last year, and a few that I made earlier than that, but the last year concretized. So I grew up as a Jew wondering, how could Germans do what they did in the Holocaust? And so there was a notion, and you don't have to be Jewish to know this notion of the good German. In other words, the person who didn't help the Nazis, who never hurt a Jew, but did nothing. And there was a general condemnation of the quote-unquote good German. And I extrapolated in my piece to the good Russian, the Russian who did nothing under communism, as about 30 to 40 million of his fellow citizens were murdered by Stalin and Lenin and their successors, but especially those two.
I think I haven't read his article, but on Behind the Bastards, Robert Evans got into the little Nazis, which were basically like the little people who kind of allowed the Nazi Party to really gain hold. And a lot of people were aligned with the Nazi Party while also believing that they could change it from the inside. And while that was happening, Jewish people were being exterminated. So maybe his article could be interesting, but I'm just going to say go check out Robert Evans' podcast Behind the Bastards about the little Nazis and the small business owners who kind of perpetuated Nazism in Germany.
So I realized, though, in the last year that silence in the face of tyranny is not a German or Russian characteristic. I have watched the people that have been singing the land of the free and the home of the brave for quite some time give in to tyranny with an ease that I never would have expected from Americans. You can't go to work. You can't open your restaurant. You can't make a living. You can't go to school, all of which is utterly irrational.
And I wanted to say that the lockdowns, like, it's not a good idea if you can't support all the small businesses financially. So, as far as the lockdowns go, if we had gone with like any other nation's model where we were subsidizing wages or even just paying people to stay home, it wouldn't have seemed as macabre as it is. But that's where we're at now, is that we had a nation that, like, we barely just passed $600 last year. And, even Republicans are still really fervent on not giving Americans $1,400, even though Bernie Sanders is fighting for that money for the Americans and small business owners who are suffering during these times, during these lockdowns, the necessity to shorten the spread of a very contagious virus. So I just find that very interesting that, like, it's tyranny to tell them to lock down, but I wonder if they would have been able to have this argument if people were paid to lock down. I don't think they would have the argument.
It has no basis in science, none whatsoever.
And they always say this too, but they never provide like why it doesn't. But like the whole idea of it is to try and shorten the spread as much as we can. Back when we had our original lockdowns, it was called flatten the curve, and it's just trying to decrease the amount of people getting the virus, which obviously the Republican Party did not care about because Trump held so many rallies before the election with tens of thousands of people who he did not care about. So much so, I think in one state he left them out there without a bus ride back to their cars, and a lot of them got hypothermia.
And people have accepted it. People have crushed their lives and crushed their children because the government said so. So, and it gets worse. By the way, it's not just the U.S., Canada, Australia, and in Quebec last weekend, you probably saw the viral video. Family had New Year's Eve. 6 people, a grand total of 6 people celebrating New Year's Eve, snitched on by a neighbor. Police came and tussled with them, arrested them, and fined them $1,500. Arrested them for gathering in their apartment for New Year's. And Garrett Garcetti, the fool who runs Los Angeles, has told us in March it's good to snitch.
Snitches get stitches. I wanted to look up though whether or not that story is true. Let me see here. So Quebec police arrest 2 people and fine 6 for violating Quebec's COVID-19 lockdown orders at a 7-person house party. So 7, not 6. Canadian police arrested 2 people after an illegal New Year's Eve party violated Quebec's COVID-19 lockdown protocols. One man is expected to face charges of assaulting a police officer and resisting arrest. A woman was also arrested for refusing to identify herself, but she was released as soon as she complied. The police said it's possible the woman could face charges. 2 officers responded to a house in Gatineau on Thursday night at around 11:30 p.m. after receiving a complaint about a party. She said 2 women answered the door and refused to cooperate with officers. They failed to present their IDs when asked by officers, which can lead to being charged with a crime. So, there were 6 adults and 1 child in the house at the time, but Quebec's current COVID-19 restrictions prohibit such gatherings. Leduc said a person who lives alone is allowed to join another family or at most receive one family for the holidays. A video taken by someone else in the house was posted to Twitter Friday and shows officers in a confrontation with a man in the doorway. Yelling can be heard in the background. Another male who was inside the house can be seen trying to hold the man back from being taken outside. The thing about it is, though, is that, like, you know, this is like a once in a century kind of pandemic or situation, and people are so YOLO that they can't even Zoom call, FaceTime, or do anything necessary to keep public safety in mind. So as far as these people go, I'm really like, sure, you can consider that the law was not fair, but at the end of the day, you broke it because you don't care about other people. So at the end of this, I do not have sympathy for them. But of course, the right wing is going to, because they're very fervent about just none of this happening. Just none of it. None of it. Nothing should be happening. There's no virus. China should have never let it out. It was a hoax. It should have been gone by Easter. All that yada, yada, yada bullshit.
It's quite a time that we live in that now Americans who used to be so suspicious, to put it mildly, of government, of any power being concentrated in the hands of the few. And now, as you're saying, you just see so many Americans going about their daily life going, well, the quote-unquote experts told us this is the way we have to live. The quote-unquote experts told us I have to do A, B, and C. And they just do it without asking too many questions. And even when things don't exactly make sense, they still, unfortunately, go along with it. So you actually make a really good point about brainwashing in your piece. You talk about, and I'm quoting you, said, that you didn't think that, you thought it could only happen in totalitarian governments, totalitarian regimes. And yet now we're seeing it in a nominally free country. Why exactly do you think that is?
Nominally.
This was another surprise to me.
We're going to look up the definition of nominally. This is going to be fun. In name only. Officially, though perhaps not in reality, are we a democracy? Oh, man. And here's the thing, is that if we actually tried to move towards a socialist, communist, or pure anarchist society, political organization, we would try to move the political power from a few hands into everyone's hands. So if you want to talk about democracy, and not just nominally democracy, but true democracy, consider far leftism.
So when I was a graduate student at Columbia, I was at what they call the Russian Institute. I studied communist countries, and I learned Russian not in order to order a cheese sandwich, but which most people do, which is fine. I studied it solely to be able to read Pravda, the Soviet communist newspaper, which I got to be able to read. And so my life has been sort of devoted to reading brainwashing news items, if you will, columns.
Propaganda.
And I was sure most of my life you could only brainwash a people in a tyranny, because there's free speech to counteract in a free press. But the free press in the United States, the mainstream press, is Pravda. So whether or not they work for the government,
I mean, how is OAN not considered Pravda, especially since like he's speaking of like Lenin or not Lenin, but Stalin at like Stalin era propaganda, where they idolized and worshipped a single leader, which OAN has done for Trump entirely. So Trump is like much closer to Stalin and his ideas of how to run a country than Dennis Prager is even leading on here. Like Trump would love if his picture was literally everywhere saying "obey." So, yeah,
I mean, it's an equal brainwash. The New York Times is essentially as honest as Pravda was, and the L.A. Times and the Washington Post. I just use New York Times. The New York Times spread the biggest lie in American history. 1619, the country was founded, and we had a revolution against Britain in order to maintain slavery. Liberal anti-Trump professors called it a lie. Sean Wilentz at Princeton is one of them, just in case people want to look this up. It's a lying newspaper. They all are.
I think the 1619 project itself is a working theory. It's not necessarily 100% on fact and history books, and it's only really been developed since that piece came out, I think last year or the year before 2019. So yeah, I think it's only a working theory that since the first slaves were brought here and then the consequential Revolutionary War was over property rights, slaves being property, they're making a through line there.
They all are. The president has been right. President Trump has been right in calling it the fake news media. That is exactly correct. That is what.
Don't believe your eyes. Don't believe your ears.
They are. And I thought that was restricted solely to dictatorships. I was wrong.
And talking of the New York Times, as we were discussing earlier with the Soviet Union as well, they also covered up for the mass humanitarian crimes that were happening under Stalin's leadership, the mass starvations that were taking place in the Ukraine. They had some of the reporters over there being driven around by the Soviets, living the high life, and they're like, I don't see anything wrong here. Everyone looks fine to me. They even wrote in some of their articles that people in the Soviet Union, specifically in the Ukraine, they're hungry.
I mean, that happens all the time in like other nations that come here, that they ignore the homelessness and the racial tensions and now the political divide, and just kind of focus in on how America is the land of equal opportunity. So, I mean, that's still something that happens. But of course, there are other journalists who are more focused on getting to know the issues so that people can alleviate them and problem solve. And it doesn't always happen. It doesn't always come through. But yeah, like the same thing happens that when people go to North Korea to document what's going on there, they tend to clean themselves up and try to present a North Korea that isn't necessarily the everyday North Korea.
But they're not starving, and that's how they tried to play the game there, unfortunately. What do you think about that?
I've written about it a lot. Walter Duranty got a Pulitzer Prize in 1932. He's the New York Times correspondent in Moscow. Stalin loved the man, gave him a great apartment, great life, and it was exactly when Stalin was deliberately starving millions of Ukrainians to death. People should read The Red Famine.
I mean, the unfortunate thing here is that like he's also not acknowledging that the landowners, it was a bit of a double-sided sword. But I'm not apologizing for what Stalin did. Stalin fucked up and starved and killed a lot of people. But there were also property owners that refused to basically give up their land to the government and burn down their properties, which were farms, which then effectively eradicated the food source. And those people didn't have as much to worry about at that point because of them having a bit more money. So, like, I don't know. There's a bit more context in it, that it's not just Stalin choosing to starve the Ukrainian people. It also has to deal with the complex political situation in Ukraine. to which landowners and property owners refuse to give up their property to the government, which I don't know. That's another discussion to have.
Applebaum, who, for the record, is a never Trumper, and I don't agree with her on politics, but she wrote a true book about what happened in Ukraine, and people should know about that. About 5 to 6 million people were slaughtered, and you will get an idea of how awful it is to starve to death, and how you end up eating human beings when that is all there is to eat. This is what was done, and the Pulitzer Prize, which should have been returned by the New York Times 80 years ago, and they still have kept it. The New York Times has 2 Pulitzer Prizes for pure lies. Durante's in 32, and last year's for the 1619 Project. This is the state of journalism in the United States.
And yet they're the ones to claim to have all this, the moral high ground when they talk to us Americans all the time. And that's the craziest thing, as you were just discussing, looking back at their history over the years. When it comes down to it, all the brainwashing that we've seen in the failing schools, how can we have our civil society? How can American voters make good decisions at the ballot box and govern themselves well, and to be able to choose wisely between candidates when we lack the basic foundations of a solid education, and in many cases so many people
Here's something interesting that Prager decided to ignore, is that the New York Times released a statement about the 1932 Pulitzer Prize awarded to Walter Duranty, which is what he's talking about. Duranty, one of the most famous correspondents of his day, won the prize for 13 articles written in 1931 analyzing the Soviet Union under Stalin. Times correspondents and others have since largely discredited his coverage. And here's what I think is pretty funny, is that like the right wing will argue that you shouldn't judge men who lived in the past for their morals. Like usually they'll bring that up, like when you say, oh, George Washington had slaves, and it's like, well, everybody had slaves back then. You shouldn't judge a man by the times he was living in, even though abolitionists existed as well, people who already believed that slavery was wrong. And yet here we are, judging a guy of his time. I'm not sure of his article itself, but I'm going to read a little bit of this. Duranty's cable dispatches had to pass Soviet censorship, and Stalin's propaganda machine was powerful and omnipresent. Duranty's analyses relied on official sources as his primary source of information, accounting for the most significant flaw in his coverage: his consistent underestimation of Stalin's brutality. And like I had just said earlier, North Korea will do the same exact thing. China will do the same exact thing. China will actually refuse certain media, like movies or TV, if it is critical of the Chinese government. So that's a thing that still happens, and it is a part of authoritarian regimes. But if you're living in a nominally democratic, faux free speech nation such as the United States, you just get a president who will say, oh, that's fake news, and that's how you deal with that. And you just need also like a whole media echo chamber to keep saying it's fake news for you too. So
are growing up even without the family unit, which is the bedrock of our society.
My listeners to my radio show frequently ask me, so what should we do first? And I have an answer. Get your kids out of public school. Not in every case. There are some public schools, I'm sure, in rural Kansas that still teach truth. But by and large, certainly in urban areas, they are just left-wing seminaries. I've often said...
So he's basically saying it's not true because I don't agree with it. But in rural areas, that's where the truth is, because I agree with it.
I started this about colleges, and now it's true about elementary schools and high schools. So I used to have a sort of riddle. Why are Christian seminaries more honest than universities? And here's the answer. Christian seminaries advertise, our purpose is to produce committed Christians. Universities lie. They don't tell you the truth. Their purpose is to produce committed leftists.
No, it's not. No, it's not. And what I find interesting too is that some people aren't gonna like me saying this, but like Christianity is something that we made up. Judaism is something that a people long time ago also made up, and so saying that a Christian seminary is selling truth, that in itself kind of gives it away that like he obviously believes in the lie of Christianity and denies science, which is actual evidence based, and saying that Christian seminaries are more honest than universities that teach science that are based in fact. Yeah, that's him doing anti-intellectualism. And so that's funny that this video is called "The Left's Lockstep Pseudo-Intellectualism," when he will say Christians are selling you the truth and universities are selling you leftist agendas. And that's anti-intellectualism, and that's a greater leap towards authoritarianism.
If the universities acknowledge that, if the New York Times said on its masthead, a left-wing newspaper, I would never attack it. It's a
See, it's all just about the perspective and point of view that you have. And if it doesn't fit Prager's, which is conservative right wing, then it's a lie.
The lie that it purports to uphold truth that is so upsetting. Same with the universities. If they said, we will teach you one way to look at life, give us your $50,000 a year, and have a great day, I would say nothing.
Even though we need to have a talk about student debt. All right, well, that's Prager. And that is the right-wing echo chamber, from Fox News to the Daily Wire to OAN, and they're all staying pretty consistent that the left are the true authoritarians. But if you just believe in Jesus Christ and Trump, if you allow Trump and Jesus Christ into your heart, then you can be saved. And that is the way to greater truth. Oh boy. Well, join me tomorrow for another episode of Tox News. It's actually going to be a different episode. What I'm going to be focusing in on, wow, this is really messed up. What I'm going to be getting into is Theory Thursday, going and reading Homo Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, Chapter 2. And I'm hoping to stay pretty consistent with it. I have his second book, Homo Deus, that to also go through. And then we also have, I just got in the mail, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, also by Yuval Noah Harari. Should be some good stuff. Actual books, people. Actual books. And then I also got in the mail Murray Bookchin's Ecology of Freedom. All of those three books that I just said, Homo Sapiens, Homo Deus, 21 Lessons, and Murray Bookchin's book, Ecology of Freedom, are pretty thick books, and so it's going to take me a minute, and I don't know if I'm going to get through all of them this year. Chapter 2 of Sapiens is tomorrow, and then also I have this one that I want to get into after the Yuval stuff, but it's Abdullah Öcalan's Manifesto for a Democratic Civilization, and it's the first volume of the books that Abdullah has been writing from prison in Turkey, and it gave inspiration to the Rojavan Revolution out in Rojava, Syria, that was led by anarchists and a really fervent feminist movement. So that's what I'm hoping to get into here for the theory. I also got a little pocket constitution. Just to stay familiar, and maybe one day this will reach into the theory realm. But I did want to read one amendment here that has to deal with President Donald J. Trump. Here it is. So it's Amendment 14, Section 3. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress, or elector of president and vice president, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States, or as a member of any state legislature, or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may by vote of 2/3 of each house remove such disability. So if you're wondering what they're impeaching Trump for, Amendment 14, Section 3. Thank you for joining me on Talks News. Tomorrow, Theory Thursday, Chapter 2, Homo Sapiens, Tree of Knowledge. Other than that, stay radical and try to keep your boomer family members off Fox News. That's all I got for you. And I hope you enjoyed it. I'll catch you on the flippity flop side. You know, you dig? You feel me? You like it like that? Ooh, boy. Where's that outro music? This is going on too long. Where is that outro music? There it is. All right. You have a beautiful time until I see you next time on Talks News.